Okay, so let's start with the second lesson of today, and it's actually the third lesson of the poetic books. And for everyone who was here before, what is the next lesson? Which book? Amen. Sorry, I didn't realize that we were going to start immediately with the next lesson. But yeah, let's just dive into it. And yes, so we're going to speak about the book of Proverbs. That works. Okay. Proverbs. All right. It is the book of Proverbs is it it is a collection of wisdom words in general, and it is portrayed in a how do you say, poetic language. The book of Proverbs is also a collection of moral and religious teachings, and it is in the form of short sayings and proverbs. And it has a practical and everyday concerns. And the words wise and wisdom we can find in the book of Proverbs mentioned 125 times. Um, yeah. Then moving on to the next slide, the authorship. And we already mentioned him before because as like just like his dad, he likes to write. um, but we have also multiple authors from the book of Proverbs, um, and a lot of it is attributed to Solomon, just like David for Psalms. Um, and also, we could also claim that there's no reason to doubt this claim, the accuracy of this claim, I mean. And we see then here according to First Kings chapter 4 verse 32, that Solomon compiled 3,000 proverbs, and those proverbs, let's say, they were bearing his name, as he was collecting them all. It was all attributed to him, and we see that he lived and reigned in the 10th century. And then also two other portions of the book, or the other authors of this book, are attributed to Agur and Lemuel. Agur wrote Proverbs 30, and Lemuel Proverbs 31. We don't have an exact date for that, but with certainty they were the authors of chapter 30 and 31. Next slide. Um, and how the book of Proverbs was composed or put into one book, is also not very clear. But we could always trace it back to Solomon. It is always associated with Solomon. We could always connect it to Solomon. But most of the book, that were when it was completed, the huge chunk of the book that was completed, it was before his death in 931 BC. And then we see then after his death, it still stayed in southern Judah. And during Hezekiah's reign, Hezekiah's men, they compiled the Proverbs of Solomon, and we see this actually in Proverbs chapter 25 and 29, and then this also indicates the final form, or when the book was complete. It was before the end of Hezekiah's reign, and that would be in 686 BC. And this is just an overview of the, let's say, history of the book of Proverbs, how they compiled everything together, and yeah, and how it is also always connected to Solomon. And then we go on to the purpose of Proverbs. Um, we find the purpose of it, or we find the answer to that is in the opening of Proverbs in chapter 1, verse 2 to 6. It was written, or it is mentioned, that to impart wisdom. Um, it is to make us less often foolish and more often wise, or just to improve our overall performance in life. Um, because wisdom is often equated with intelligence. It's always, some people think it's the same, but likewise to that, with the contrast of wisdom is foolishness, and it is equated with lack of intelligence. But it is not really about the mental ability, but it is more about the moral ability. There's a difference. And then when the book of Proverbs speaks about foolishness, it describes more about the moral deficiency and not the lack of intelligence, and or as opposed to mental deficiency. So wisdom is therefore more ethical than intellectual. It is, yeah. And we see in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, yes? It is more ethical than intellectual. Yeah, moral deficiency, yes. And if we go to Proverbs chapter 1 to 7, it declares the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and or of wisdom. And we all can also see that, some references to that we see in Job chapter 28 to chapter 28 verse 28, Psalms 111 and 10, Proverbs 9 and 10, and Proverbs 15:33. Mhm. Job chapter 28 verse 28, Psalms 111 and 10, verse 10, sorry, 111 verse 10, Proverbs chapter 9 verse 10, and then Proverbs chapter 15 verse 33. And again, wisdom is not about the intellect, but it is, or in as a view, as a general term, it is viewing life and self from God's perspective. That's how Proverbs was written. It was from God's perspective, and which is also the one and true valid perspective in life, is God's perspective. And Solomon realized that, but before he realized that after no, he realized it, but then he became foolish. um, but yeah, and then also one of the most important thing about wisdom is it is more valuable than wealth, and Proverbs speaks about it in, again, some references. Um, yeah, it's more valuable than wealth. We find this in chapter 3, verse 14 to 15, chapter 8, verses 10 to 11, and then 19 as well, and then Proverbs chapter 16, verse 16, and Proverbs 20, verse 15. Those are the references to wisdom, that it is more valuable than wealth. And then we can also go to wisdom, that it is more. Alles noch von vorne? Yeah. So The references to that is in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 14 to 15. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 10 to 11 and 19, verse 19. And then chapter 16, verse 16, and chapter 20, verse 15. And then we have wisdom being more powerful than physical strength. And we find this in Psalms chapter 21, verse 22. And then chapter 24, verses 5 to 6. Ah, I'm sorry, Proverbs. I'm still in the last lesson in my head. Yeah, everything in Proverbs. It is more powerful than physical strength. Yes, so it doesn't matter if you can lift 300 kilograms of deadlifts. If you're wise, it's more powerful. But yeah, moving on to no, I cannot even lift 300. So okay, wisdom also leads to quantity of life. Quantity of life. It and we find that in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 16. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 10, and then Proverbs chapter 9, verse 11. It leads to quantity of life. So we live longer. And then also with that, the quality of life improves. Um, when we see that also in chapter 3, verse 16 to 18 now, and chapter 8 to 18 and 21, and Proverbs chapter 24, verse 4. This is the quality of life, how wisdom improves the quality of life if we imply it. So, next slide. Um, to whom was the book of Proverbs written? Do you know? Huh? Yeah. Just a guess. Even if it's wrong or just yeah, goes in the right direction. It was talking about the virtuous woman, of course, but it was um, not directed to women specifically. But you can be inspired, of course. Yeah, you can say that. It was actually primarily to young people. Yeah. And we find that in verse 1, chapter 1 to 4, chapter 1, verse 4. Because we see the continual reference, my son. Yeah, Proverbs 1 4. And yeah, as I said, there's a continual reference of or to my son. And yeah, we can see that. Yeah, I can give you reference to that in chapter 1 and 8, and chapter 1, verse 8, and 10, and 15, and then chapter 2, verse 1. Warte nochmal. My son, also die reference is to son. Aha. Nein, nein, Kapitel 1, Vers 4. Ah, ja, ja. Um, or do you think he was writing to his sons? Name one son of Solomon. Was he writing to Rehoboam? Rehoboam. But that is not clear. But he most likely written proverbs to his students. We didn't know that. I don't know if you knew that about Solomon, but it is believed that he was a headmaster of a school of wise men. Um, yeah, it is believed that he's a teacher, headmaster actually, of a school of wise men. Headmaster of a school of wise men. Because it was also very typical in that day for a teacher to address his students as son. So it makes sense. And also going back to Proverbs, because as I said, it was directed to young people, but specifically to young Israeli men. So we said it before, Israel. Someone said Israel, and it was for them because they were. It was a preparation for them for leadership positions, and that's why it was also, as I said, it was, as I said before, the virtuous woman that we find in chapter 31. It was for the young men. It was an explanation for young men how to differentiate the wicked woman and the virtuous woman. That's why we don't see um, or we don't read in Proverbs about wicked and virtuous men. Is it clear? Okay, moving on. And we see this. Maybe it brought up a question when you read about when you read Proverbs is about the wisdom, because when it talks about wisdom, it is personified as a woman, and we read that in chapter 1 verse 20 and verse 33 as well, chapter 8 verse 120, huh? Okay, soll ich es wiederholen? Chapter 1 verse 20 and 33, and then chapter 8. And it describes her as to have that she has a firm house which she invites everyone to come, and that is this reference we read in chapter 9 verse 16. And she's also as I said before, she's also contrasted with the woman that is foolish or wicked. That is in chapter 9 verse 13. Also, she's described as a temptress that leads people to destruction. She tempts people, specifically young men. And we read this in chapter 9, verse 13 to 18. And one of the controversial things about the description of wisdom is, as I said before, the personification, and it led to speculation that it could be even an angelic being or even as a description of Christ. But those interpretations they depend on to the ritual, literal reading of Proverbs, as we read before, or as we said before, because we also have to imply the figurative language in Proverbs as well. That's why we cannot take it too literal when it talks about the personification of wisdom. Doesn't make it any sense? It is just an poetic how do you say, description of God's attribute or God's character, and not a separate person or being. It is again figurative. Yeah, it is figurative in a figurative language. It is never a separate being. Because yes, a lot of people. That's why I said before, one of the things when we look at Psalms or Proverbs is to also see it from the perspective of the writers. It was never intended to see every single verse as a literal meaning. We we had this example in Psalms when we say God is my rock, but He's not really a rock. He's like a rock. The attributes. Does it make sense? It is just the wisdom. It is about. It is a poetic description of God's character. So it is not a actual woman or whatever. Moving on. And one of the, not just specifically to the wicked woman or the virtuous woman, but we can see, or we can also kind of place ourselves where we are between those two types of people in the book, and it is the foolish and the wise. Or if you look at Proverbs as a, let's say, as a drama, the who would be the two main characters? Exactly. So if we can also kind of see it in that way, it is the whole book. It is essentially a contrast between those two. And again, um, we have always to keep in mind that the wisdom that is described is not intellectual, or the foolishness is not about mental concepts, but they are ethical and moral. It always directs us to God or away from God. Okay, moving on. Now we will also have a lot of references. I didn't put them on the slide, but I will read it again. But we have the characteristics of the foolish of the fool. And one of those characteristics we can see is about his tongue, how he uses his tongue. And a fool is known for misusing his tongue, how he speaks. And one of those attributes we can find in Proverbs is he's boisterous. He cannot control what he says, and that is in chapter 9, verse 13. And then he spreads slander. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18. And also, or even contrary to James chapter 1, 19, where it tells us to be to, or it is the opposite of that is to that a fool is slow to hear and quick to speak. Is the opposite of what James chapter 1 verse 19 says. And also we can trace it also in Proverbs about that fool that is slow to hear and quick to speak in chapter 18 verse 13 and chapter 29 verse 20. And also a fool is perverse in his speech, and that we will see that in Proverbs chapter 19 verse 1. And he's also self-destructive, and we see that in chapter 10 verse 14. and 7, 14 and 7, and chapter 14. I'm sorry, chapter 10, verse 14. Yeah. Uh-huh. And then we have 14, chapter 14, verse 3, and chapter 18, verse 6 to 7. Exactly. And that is that all those attributes, they all we trace back to the tongue of a fool, how he speaks. And now we go to the response to wisdom that a fool has. And he does not receive wisdom, not at all. And we see that he despises wisdom in chapter 1, verse 7, and then also in chapter 23, verse 9. He despises wisdom, and also he despises instructions. Chapter 1 and verse 7. And he neglects and does not accept counsel. Yes? Sorry? He despises wisdom. He does not receive wisdom. And as I said, he neglects and does not accept counsel. And we can find those references in chapter 1, verse 25, and chapter 1, verse 30. And that is all. And we're still talking about the fool's response to wisdom. Um, he doesn't want to or doesn't listen to reproof or rebuke. And we read that in chapter 1, verse 25 again, and chapter 13, verse 1, and chapter 9, verse 8, chapter 12, verse 1, chapter 15, and verse 12. And a fool, he also hates knowledge. And we can read that in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 22, and Proverbs 1, verse 29. Or, yeah. This is still this is still one of the characteristics. And then he, he, del- he doesn't delight in understanding. And we see that in chapter 18, verse 2. And then also concerning discipline, he rejects it. He doesn't respond to discipline. And we find that in chapter 15 and 5. And chapter 17, verse 10. And chapter 27 and verse 22. He doesn't respond to discipline, and he does not choose the fear of the Lord. Chapter 1, verse 29. And then another characteristic of a fool is he affects his family. He has a bad attitude towards his family, or specifically, he has a detrimental impact upon his parents. And we see that in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1, that he grieves his parents. Chapter 17 and 21, and verse 25 as well. Verse 21 and 25. It also describes how he despises his mother and his father. And also, he has a false estimation of himself. He's proud. He thinks the fool thinks that his way is right in his own eyes, and we see that in Proverbs 12 verse 15. Proverbs verse Proverbs 12 verse 15. And moving on, and this is I think one of the main themes of this world is to trust in your own heart, and that is in the book of Proverbs foolish. It is one of the attributes of a fool is when he trusts his own heart, and that is in chapter 28 verse 26. And it also describes him being arrogant and proud and haughty. In that we will find that in chapter 14 verse 16, 21 of chapter 21 and 24. Verse 24, sorry. And he also, as we said before, he is prideful, he exalts himself. And we can see this, we can also, if we look at that directly, we can see these attributes, it all goes to the devil. Yeah, he exalts himself. We find this in chapter 30, verse 32. Chapter 30, verse 32. And another attribute we can also add to the fool is he enjoys sin. His attitude towards sin, he enjoys it. How Proverbs describes that, or that foolishness is, he's doing wickedness like if it's a sport. Or it's a sport to him, and we see that in chapter 10, verse 23. And I think it's very important because after the fool we go to the wise men, but it is so very important to have this in detail and to know where we find those attributes, because it is sometimes also kind of like a mirror to us when we read Proverbs. It is a mirror if we can find ourselves more in the characteristics of a fool or of a wise man. And so this is also a reminder of ourselves, okay, where we could improve ourselves in, because some of the things that I read, I can see myself if I'm honest. And so it is so necessary to know those things so we can go away from that, or in particularly to the wise men we can apply those things. That's why we go it in detail and slowly, and also have the reference to it, because as I said, it is all biblical and all it is very important. Exactly, yeah. Proverbs is like a mirror for us. Um, and it is also one of the attributes of a wicked person or a foolish one is it is even abominable for him to turn away from evil. It's very extreme. Abominable to turn away from evil. So he likes to stay in wickedness. And we see that, we read that in chapter 13, verse 19. Um, I would say something practical. I would say that someone who's not willing to turn away from his wicked ways, someone who likes to stay in that state of life or attitude, that is even for him, that I would say that it's hard for him to turn away from that way of life. But I would say it can go for both sides, because there's still every person has a moral compass. Everyone knows what morals are, and if someone decides to continue to harm people and hate people, it doesn't matter if you're Christian or not. It still applies to both. To both. Moving on, he even we can discuss it when this lesson is done. He even mocks at sin. Um, we find this in chapter 14, verse 9. 14, verse 9. He mocks at sin. Hmm? Well, you underestimate the power of sin. You think it doesn't affect you, but it does. And then also, I think this is very well known, especially for us Christians, that the foolish one goes back to his, like a dog to his vomit. I think everyone knows this reference, but we read that in chapter 26, verse 11. And also other characteristics, not towards sin, but just in general, as the character of a fool is he's also quick-tempered, or he loses his temper really quick. He's not really wise, making a wise decision before he acts upon it. So we find this in chapter 12, verse 16. Um, chapter 14, verse 17. Ga je verschlukken? Chapter 14, verse 17 and verse 29. It's still about the temper of a fool. And verse 29, chapter 29, verse 11. And another characteristic, he lacks foresight. So he's not really thinking about the consequences that comes after, or he doesn't think about. Um, he's just living in now, in the moment. Yeah. And we see those things in this world. You only live once, and all that junk. But yeah, we see that in chapter 23. Chapter 22, verse 3, and chapter 27, verse 12. Chapter 23, chapter 22, verse 3. Yeah. And also the last thing, he's quarrelsome, or he likes to argue or fight. And we find this in chapter 20, verse 3, and chapter 22, verse 10. And then, yeah, so that is I know it was a lot, but it is very helpful to know those characteristics, and that we can make sure we don't find those things in ourselves. And if we do, we go to God. And then now the more positive approach is of the wise men. And this is something that we should imply into our lives and not turn away from those things. Or let's say the wise man is everything that the fool isn't, simply said. Because if we go back again, the wise man is known for his proper use of his tongue. When we talk about the tongue again, and if we go in details, he exercises verbal restraint, and we read that in chapter 10, verse 19, and chapter 17, verse 27 to 28. That is when he restrains his tongue. And not only that, but his tongue, his speech, it brings healing. And we find that in chapter 12, verse 18, sorry. Chapter 12, verse 18. And also in contrast to the fool, how he despises wisdom, the wise man, he welcomes wisdom. He's becoming wiser. Yes, and if we go in detail, he hears wisdom. He increases in learning, and we see that in chapter 1, verse 5, chapter 9, verse 9, and chapter 21, verse 11. He increases in learning. I hope so. And he also, not like the fool, he also acquires or listens to and receives counsel. Because the foolish one, he despises it as well. He despises instruction. Um, a reference to it is Proverbs 13, verse 10. And also the fool, he despises rebuke, but the wise man, he regards it, or he listens to it, he loves it. And a reference to that scripture reference is chapter 17, verse 10, and chapter 19, verse 25. But yeah, I'm hurrying him up now. He, yeah, that's his response to wisdom. And he brings, not like the fool, he brings joy to his parents. He adds to his family. A reference to that is chapter 15 and verse 20, chapter 29, verse 3. And a wise man, he also has the right estimation of himself. Not like the fool, he has a wrong one, but he has a right one. Because he's wise, he's humble. He's not proud, but he's humble. And we see that in chapter 11, verse 2. And the fool, he enjoys sin, or loves sin, but the wise man fears the Lord. We read that in chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 9, verse 10. Because when the fear of the Lord, it is not compatible with evil. If we truly fear the Lord, it is, let's say, it is easier to turn away from evil. And Proverbs talks about it in chapter 3, verse 7. And just like on the fool, he has a quick temper, but the wise man is slow to anger and doesn't lose his temper. He can restrain himself. And we see that in chapter 12, verse 6. And he has foresight, not just like the fool. He thinks in advance. And then also the wise man, he maintains good fellowship, good associations, and he avoids bad ones that are influencing influencing him in a bad way. Do you have any questions? As I said before, Proverbs, the same case in Proverbs. If you go in detail, we have to spend multiple days probably. But again, it is just an overview, the contrast of the people in the book, and just an overall view of how to live life or how to live a spiritual life, specifically. But it's also very practical. Do you have any questions or any remarks? Yeah, it's because whenever you read Proverbs, you sometimes find yourself in one of those categories. And so, yeah, I encourage you also to study it and to use it as a mirror, a spiritual mirror for yourself. Yeah, because we don't want to become the foolish one. Okay, if there's no other questions, then yeah, this lesson is also, we're done. And thank you very much. And until next time. Now you guys have a lunch break.